Hello folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and today we are bound one more time for the final frontier. This is kind of a send-off to Book Trek 2024, the Wrath of the Summer of Trek, which was a BookTube event that was created originally by Vin at Revenant Reads to get us all to be reading Star Trek fiction for the summer. And he's had a number of co-hosts helping him out with the event, and I'll leave links to all of their channels in the notes down below. So be sure and check them out if you're a Star Trek fan, as well you should be. But today I'm going to be talking about Spock Must Die by James Blish, which was first published by Bantam Books in February of 1970. And it is usually credited as being the very first Star Trek novel, original Star Trek fiction for adults. There was Mission to Horatius that had been written a couple years earlier by Mack Reynolds, but that was a young adult book. It was written for kids, so not adult Star Trek original fiction. There had been 3 collections written by James Blish up until this time of short stories that were all adaptations of original Star Trek scripts. And those have been published for the last 3 years, leading up to Spock Must Die. But those had all been published during Star Trek's original first run showings of episodes on network television back in the late 60s. And now, by the time Spock Must Die was being published, Star Trek had been canceled for the last time, and there were going to be no new adventures of Captain Kirk and the Starship Enterprise. No more fresh episodes of Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and the rest of the Enterprise crew. Those were pretty much going to be done, at least professionally. There was fan fiction, but there wasn't going to be any more professionally written Star Trek stories unless they were going to be in book form. And Bantam had the licensing rights then for Star Trek, and their first 3 collections of James Blish's adaptations had been selling great. It was the only place that Star Trek fans were going to be able to get Star Trek stories anymore. This was just on the verge of the original episodes going into syndication for the first time. This was just right at the end of Star Trek's third and last season, and it was going into syndication. During which time, and nobody knew this yet, it was really going to take off then. It would find all new audiences everywhere and really become popular. And so Bantam Books was lucky in that they were deciding, let's have written for us an original Star Trek story. Since there aren't going to be any more, maybe we can do some things in this book that we wouldn't be able to get to see if it was an ongoing series. And James Blish was happy to do this because he'd seen the biggest checks in his lifetime coming in because of those 3 collections of Star Trek episodes that he had done. So the idea of writing a 4th Star Trek book, and this being an original story that he could come up with, he was on board for that, definitely. And because there weren't going to be any more follow-up episodes to any of the characters or what might happen to the Starship Enterprise or anything, he felt like he could kind of take some chances and do some things with some characters that he didn't have to worry about so much anymore. And Frederik Pohl, who was the editor of the Star Trek books for Bantam at that time, agreed. Pohl had never really paid much attention to Star Trek in the first place, unfortunately. So he just thought, yeah, if you have a good story and put it in a Star Trek form, we'll go with it, and maybe we'll continue to make some money off of this little pocket franchise here. I guess I shouldn't say a pocket franchise. It will go to pocket books later on, but right now it's a Bantam franchise. And so he kind of was thinking, I've heard that the character of Spock had become, in the United States, a kind of a unexpected breakout character, especially amongst female viewers. The hero was always intended to be Captain Kirk, of course, but Spock was very, very popular in the United States. And I say in the United States because James Blish was living in the UK at the time and had famously at that time never seen a Star Trek episode, even though he had already written 3 collections based on the scripts of Star Trek episodes. But he had never seen an episode. And that's largely due to the fact, I think we can forgive him for this, he was living in the UK since 1964. And the series Star Trek had only been in the United States from 1966 through 1969, only debuting in the UK in the summer of 1969. So he had probably seen photos and things and maybe clips perhaps, but never had been able to just immerse himself in watching the actual episodes with the performances of all the actors and actresses and just the nuances. Just had never seen it come to life on his TV screen in the way that we had. And I had been reading those collections since they had been coming out as a kid because I was enjoying the series, but they always felt a little off somehow. And not just because he was writing often from early scripts or first drafts even, because the show was still in production at the time. So a lot of the stories weren't quite the same as we saw them on TV. He was writing from earlier drafts and outlines. Aside from that, just the characters, the way he depicted the characters and things, never really quite rang true for me. And even when he wrote Spock Must Die, now he could write whatever he wanted as a full novel. Still didn't quite feel like the characters, although Bantam probably thought if anyone's going to write this, it should be Blish. Who knows these characters better than he does? He's been writing these short stories for a long time, but he'd never seen an episode. So I think that's why, at least to me anyway, his characterizations of our famous crew felt like they were written a little naively, maybe. And they just didn't quite feel like the people we had known for 3 years that we were watching every week. That's my take on it. But there are some oddities about those books anyway. Okay, sorry about that, folks. I had to take a little break because my neighbor next door here decided this was a good day to mow his lawn. And he's just about 5 or 10 yards on the other side of this wall right here. So it was a little noisy for shooting this video. But getting back to Spock Must Die. So when that came out in February of 1970, I was still grieving the loss of Star Trek as for new episodes, even though I had known for a year that it wasn't coming back. And that last summer of 69 of the summer reruns of that show were sporadic at best. The network had pretty much given up on it and knew it wasn't coming back. So it wasn't playing on its regular night. They would move it all around whenever they wanted to, preempted entirely. So there was no following Star Trek anymore. And it hadn't started being syndicated yet either. So it was just a mess. So when I first saw it show up on the book stands at my local Save-On drugstore up by the house where I lived in as a kid, I couldn't wait to get home and read a brand new Star Trek story. Not just another adaptation like Blish had written before, but now he had written an original story, all new. So I got that book home and plopped down to read it, and was almost immediately disappointed by something that happens throughout the book, really. Maybe kind of a minor thing, but as a Star Trek fan, it just really doesn't feel right. And that was that for some reason, Blish was calling McCoy Doc through the whole book. Doc, not Bones. Although he had Kirk calling him Bones through the first 3 books of adaptations without any problem. But now suddenly he's Doc. Everyone's calling him Doc. And in the series, only Kirk called McCoy Bones, but nobody called him Doc. Now, I guess there were less than a handful of episodes where he is called Doc for specific reasons or for within the context of the stories, didn't really raise an eyebrow. But when it's nothing but Doc all the time through this whole book, as a Star Trek fan reading it, it just every time it comes up, you just kind of grit your teeth a little bit and you get through it. So that was disappointing. Now, I have heard since then that the idea for doing that was in editing before publishing it, was that Blish had written it as Bones originally. But it was thought that people that weren't familiar with Star Trek, the nickname Bones was so odd and unusual that it might kind of throw readers. But yet, that still doesn't make sense to me, because who would be reading this book if not for Star Trek fans? Anyway, well, we can move past that, but it still bugs me to this day. I'm trying to let it go. But then, in the next few pages here, Blish came up with an idea that kind of made my eyes bug out as a kid reading it. And this is something that has come up in Star Trek since and discussed quite a bit ever since. But this was the first time it occurred to me, or was presented to me in any way. And that was the idea that the transporter, McCoy, is discussing philosophically with... is it Scotty? I think it was Scotty, about how the transporter works. And is it possible that when someone steps onto the transporter pad and is energized and he's broken down into his component parts, doesn't that kill him? And that whatever appears on the other side is just an exact duplicate with the same thoughts and emotions, memories, experience, all of that makes that person, but is just a duplicate, is just a copy. The original is dead. Does the soul transfer over? So there's this philosophical discussion in the book that just kind of blew my mind as a kid then, thinking, because having watched 3 seasons of original Star Trek shows back as a kid in those days, I wanted to live on the Enterprise. I wanted to go through that transporter and beam all over the place. And now I wasn't so sure I wanted to do that anymore, because I started to think, that makes sense. How do we know that? What would make the ego or the soul, or whatever you might call it, go with the person? Why isn't that just a duplicate? And Spock even is mentioning in the story during this discussion that a difference that makes no difference is no difference. So he was just kind of saying, well, it doesn't really matter. You can't tell. But tell that to the guy that is already disintegrated and is dead if it makes no difference. Would it make... Anyway, even now I would wrestle with it. Would I do it? Would I step through that thing? Anyway, getting back to the story. So, but that's the idea that Blish came up with that then set up the story of Spock Must Die. And that was that... he set up a situation where the Organians, who had created the Organian Peace Treaty to keep the Klingons and the Federation from killing each other, from going into battles and wars and all that, keep us at arm's distance from each other, and that was the treaty. But now the Organians have disappeared. They've kind of gone MIA. No one can get in touch with them. The Klingons are up to no good. Organians aren't stepping in. Something's rotten in Denmark here, and but the Enterprise is too far away to get there and in person. So they decide they're going to adapt the transporter to be able to transmit Spock to Organia. But in order to get there in time, they're going to have to convert him, rather than just to regular electrons and atomic particles, into tachyons, which are atomic particles that can travel faster than light. They can only travel faster than light. And so by transmitting him to Organia, he can get there before even a subspace message could get there. Now, the Klingons have somehow, what they've been up to is they have somehow found a way of shielding Organia so that the Organians, whatever their thought powers are, won't transmit beyond Organia, and nothing from outside can transmit into Organia. So when they transport Spock, a duplicate Spock, to Organia, his signal just bounces back, and we wind up with 2 Mr. Spocks in the transporter booth. Now, to do this, Scotty had to build kind of an enclosure around the regular transporter booth, so anyone operating the transporter can't see the people or the person in the chamber. But so when the duplicate Spock comes back, now they don't know which Spock is the original and which is the duplicate. But because he reflected off Organia before he came back, the duplicate is actually a mirror image. So he is flopped physically from the original Spock. And somehow they still can't tell the difference. And they're troubled over this because just like in The Enemy Within, when a similar thing happened with Kirk, you have a good guy and a bad guy version of our character here, in this case, Mr. Spock, but is actually a mirror image. Why can't they tell the difference? Nobody noticed when they first appeared on the transporter booth together and they're in the chamber talking to him. What's going on? There's two Spocks. No one noticed that one of them had his Starfleet insignia on the other side of his tunic. But the duplicate Spock knows he's not the genuine article. So once they leave the transporter and are trying to go about their business and trying to decide what to do about this other Spock, he's already planning and plotting on how he can make people think he's the original Spock. He knows the difference, but he's trying to keep that a secret. And he kind of goes into a little kind of a hermit mode in order to stay away from the crew and all that, while still going about his business as an officer of the crew. But aren't there a million ways that you could, just as the reader, just think, why didn't they, just when Spock is fascinated by something, or he'll raise one eyebrow. It's always the right eyebrow, isn't it? Unless he raises both of them. But wouldn't that be a tell? Wouldn't a medical tricorder be able to tell that his heart is where his liver should be? That would be on the other side then, right? A simple medical scan. Aren't his fingerprints on record somewhere? Just you could probably think of a dozen different things where you could tell a mirror image is the bad guy here. One of the things that Kirk wants to do right away, Kirk calls them Spock 1 and Spock 2, just so they can talk about these two different entities here, versions of Spock. So he decides to give him, to swap his Academy class ring with Spock. In this book, they wear class rings. That's kind of an interesting idea, but wouldn't work for the actual production. But for the sake of the story, it made sense. But then, so when they swap rings, wouldn't they be able to tell of the two Spocks which one had a reverse ring? Is there no writing or a graduation year or a star date or anything on there? No logo of the Academy that would be reversed? Anyway, you get the idea. I would think there'd be any number of ways to even just casually notice the difference between a mirror image of the original or not. And Blish does come up with one that's rather convoluted and kind of extreme. It's interesting little science fiction device that he uses to do this. Completely unnecessary, though, and it's another one of those things. It's like, all right, you're dragging us through this thing here. It doesn't seem really quite believable that if we can't tell a good Spock from an evil Spock otherwise, aside from being a mirror image. But anyway, so Blish does have an interesting little device, a story at the scene at the end where the two Spocks and Kirk, they are down on the planet of Organia. They've managed to get there physically, and they have somehow gotten through the Klingons' shield around Organia, trying to find out what happened down there. But because the Organians are not projecting their thought illusions and images, what have you, so that as humans or physical beings can identify with things, it's just this weird psychedelic trip of a... Hold on, my ship just went out. Be right back. All right, I think we're back in business now. So you can't do a Star Trek episode without some engineering difficulties, apparently. So these videos are no different. But where were we? Back to the planet, the surface of Organia. And so the Enterprise has managed now to get to Organia physically, but the Organians are not projecting a little village or physical expressions of themselves for the benefit of other physical beings so that they can understand and identify with them. That's not happening. Instead, it's just we're in that thought world somehow that the Organians naturally live in that we don't understand or can't interpret in any way. And this is the scene where the two Spocks and Kirk ultimately come to the final conflict here, where we're going to determine which Spock must die. And I remember reading it at the time that it struck me then. I don't think you would think about this so much now, reading it today, but at the time, psychedelic drugs, that was just a huge thing in the popular culture, and so many TV shows and movies and stories and just things we'd talk about as kids in school. Psychedelic drugs, and just Marvel Comics, Doctor Strange, and all these weird cosmic worlds that you would float through all seem to be kind of trying to capitalize on the psychedelic experience somehow, cleaning up a little bit so we didn't get all drug culture-y or anything. But that's how I read this scene from James Blish in Spock Must Die when it first came out. It just seemed at the time to be an obvious attempt to work in an LSD trip. That's how that book read to me then, and reading it here just recently, I was reminded of that. But I also understand that it's not that unusual now for stuff like that to be going on. And I mean, we've had so many movies like The Matrix and other things that it just comes and goes without notice, that sort of a thing. But back then, I really took that as being a nod at psychedelia, for what it's worth. Okay, so those are some observations that I have on reading Spock Must Die then and now. And but now we'll wrap the video up here by going through a few pieces of art, of cover art. I like to do that on my channel here. So we'll just take a look at some of the editions that Bantam published through the years, and we'll start with the very first publication here from that February 1970 edition. Now, Spock Must Die was the fourth Bantam paperback to come out. As I mentioned before, James Blish had written 3 collections of adaptations that had become very popular. So when they designed the cover for Spock Must Die, I think that they're trying to pick up that same narrow sliver of art down the middle of the cover that they did on Star Treks 2 and 3. We still don't get any original cover art or illustration for any of these, really. Even the first one with that great James Bama illustration on the first collection of Star Trek short stories was not created for the book. It was created, that was actually a promotional image that was created by, or to promote the show when it was first premiering on NBC some years earlier. So Bantam was able to get that artwork, not have to go to the expense of commissioning special artwork for it. Same with Spock Must Die here. So they're just falling back like they did on 2 and 3 with promotional photography. And so we got Mr. Spock here. They have flopped him to, no pun intended, reflect the actual story. And it's kind of an interesting way of handling it, really, because it does suggest that mirrored image of the duplicate Spock. The only problem with it is that, and I didn't have Photoshop in those days, but I wish they could have touched the photo up a little bit at least, so that we didn't see all the lab paraphernalia that is off to one side of Spock, ghosted now and flopped on top and across his face in both images. Kind of looks like a little Rorschach test going on there, but those are racks and things that beakers and test tubes would hang on and from and against. And Spock himself is holding a very 20th century Pyrex flask, the lab equipment we all had in our science classes back in junior high and high school in those days. It's even got the Pyrex logo on it. We can overlook all that. But it wasn't until years later that I realized that, oh, the reason that image looks so familiar was that Gold Key Comics used it on issue number 1 of their own Star Trek title of comic books. And so I'll just put those up next to each other here so you can see there is Mr. Spock. You can get a much clearer view of him holding his little Pyrex flask there with the lab equipment behind him as it was intended to see. And that bright orange cover art for Spock Must Die became iconic through the 1970s, or most of the 70s, during which time Blish continued to write new collections of script adaptations. And they all followed that kind of narrow sliver format down the middle with the big Star Trek 4, 5 big display numbers. Spock Must Die didn't have that, of course, but in the meantime, Bantam was also having other original Star Trek novels commissioned and written and published. And those covers did not follow the central sliver down the middle format. They had their own covers. And then in 1978, they were starting to republish these with new cover art to kind of unify all the original fiction novels that Bantam had been publishing under a similar look. And many of them were illustrated by the cover artist Bob Larkin. And here is that cover art. On the left, we see the original edition from October 1978. And then in April 84, they used the same cover art, and they just changed their line of original Star Trek novels to have a little bit different typography. The same image here. And I usually like Bob Larkin's artwork. He's always been good at, well, he was a big illustrator for Marvel Comics and other publishers and things. And one of the great things that he could do is give us, when his cover characters were based on actors or recognizable faces and things, he was great at being able to integrate recognizable features into original illustrations. And unfortunately, this one is probably not one of the better examples of that. It still works pretty well, but it's clear that he just was copying almost verbatim a photo of Mr. Spock here, and he just flopped it without much nuance here. You can even kind of tell if you look closely at it that the lighting is even reversed on the two Spock standing there. He did decide to move the Starfleet emblem over to the other side so they weren't mirror images. But that's almost a mistake in this case, because he is supposed to be a mirror image. He should have had, Spock should have the emblem on one side of his shirt on one and the other side of his shirt on his duplicate there. The lighting wouldn't flop, but it just struck me as kind of a shortcut, the way they illustrated this. And then there's one other tiny little nitpicky thing that I'm going to spend way too much time talking about here, but it just always kind of bugs me when I notice it. And maybe it does you too. If you're a Star Trek fan, you can understand why picking nits is half the fun sometimes. But and as an art director for most of my career, I can understand why an oversight like this will often happen. But it's when you commission original illustrations for specific books, you get something basically wrong. And in this case, it's really no big deal. No one else is going to care about this but somebody like me. But from the point of view of, we're standing here right behind Captain Kirk. I guess that's supposed to be Kirk on the deck of the transporter room, looking up into the chamber of the transporter booth. Should not be able to see in there. That, according to the story, was all walled off specifically so that the reader couldn't see the duplicate Spock appearing in there, and then thereby getting confused as to which is the real Spock and which is the duplicate. Really doesn't matter here, but I just have to point it out that it bugs me. Now, just to explain too much probably, the real world reason for an oversight like that, if you can even really consider it an oversight, but it's just production driven. An illustrator who gets a commission like this will, more times than not go to the time or trouble of actually reading the book. They're going to go by a description or a little brief or a synopsis or something provided by the publisher or the art director. And it's also deadline driven. We need to send this thing to press next Friday. So whatever you're going to do, we need it by Wednesday. And probably in this case, Bob Larkin got a little description that said, the book is about a computer or a transporter malfunction that creates a duplicate Spock, and make it interesting. And by the way, here's some pictures of Mr. Spock that you can use for reference, and just call it a day. So that's what's really going on. I just like to get in the weeds like that sometimes, and I'm going to drag you through the weeds with me here times like this. All right, now let's move on to the third and final cover here, and then I've got one more cover I'm going to follow up with just because it's interesting. But first, let's take a look at this Kazuhiro Sano cover art from the June 1999 edition. Now, if you're a Star Trek fan looking at this cover art for the first time, you're probably going to think that it's pretty good. It looks great. And in fact, I will agree in that it is technically very good. Sano does a great job in giving us two Mr. Spocks that look exactly like Mr. Spock. All that great detail in the Klingon ships overhead, all of that. Looks great. But might you agree with me, if I'm still wearing my art director's cap here, that Sano is really giving us nothing new. And this is supposed to be a new Star Trek story, although 1999 aside here, but an original story. Don't we want to see some original imagery? And instead, we're just getting painted versions of very familiar headshots and shots of ships and things. And there's just really no life to it. I will say there's a little energy to it in that lightning bolt, but it's striking Mr. Spock on the head there where we get absolutely no reaction. What is the use of that other than maybe a literal metaphor? But there just doesn't feel like there's any nuance to it, no essence of storytelling here. It's just really a montage of existing images, but painted rather than just photoshopped together. And to me, that's disappointing. When this cover came out, Bantam was re-releasing all of their original Star Trek novels with new cover art and all that, and Sano did all of those, or at least most of them. And he followed that same formula, where he would just take existing images and paint them and compose them on these covers. And together, I have to admit, they do look great, but they're just, to me, it always just seemed like a cheap shortcut in order to get new original artwork. Again, there's all the deadlines and things to deal with and that kind of a thing. But if we just look at them as a group, yeah, they look great together. Definitely a series of books that all go together, the same publisher and all that. But is there really anything new in there? And I'll bet if you're a Star Trek fan like I am, that you can look at most of those images and recognize exactly where those shots are from. Other episodes or promotional shots or whatever. And Sano has just taken them, built nice compositions and things out of each one. But really, when they're all together, they all really look pretty much the same. And a lot of them could be used on any Star Trek cover that had the same characters in them. Now, Sano is not the only one to do this. Almost any franchise that has been licensed by a book publisher that is creating new stories based on an existing TV show or movie, they often fall back on this device. And it works pretty well, and we get new artwork and all that, but I just miss the days when we would get really original artwork that depicts that book, that particular story, and would never work as well or as successfully on some other book, even from the same series. So that's my 2 cents on that kind of thing. And with that, I'll follow this up with, I will usually only focus on U.S. editions for cover art when I talk about the cover art, just to keep the number of covers to a manageable number. There's often a lot of UK covers a lot of great artwork, but my videos, I think, sometimes go on long enough already. But in this case, I'm going to go for one more with the Japanese cover that came out in February 1973 by Toru Kanamori. And to me, this is an example of cover art that really has some life and energy to it. Completely unexpected. When I first saw this, I couldn't look away. I had to just explore it. It's not expected. And as technically good as those Sano illustrations were, I don't look at them for very long. Maybe you're like me. But this one, even though it's mostly all wrong, I can't help, as a Star Trek fan, but just snoop around in it and look at it and admire it in so many ways. There's just a a unique energy to it. And I prefer this over the Sano illustrations that are technically correct, accurate, all of that. But this just has an energy to it. I would love to have this artist, Toru Kanamori, do all the covers for the Bantam books at some point. Maybe he did, but this is the only one that I could find for the Spock Must Die edition here. It could be that, like Blish, he had never seen the show, living in Japan at the time, so just had a very rough description of what's going on. And like Blish, he had the scripts but had never seen the show to maybe accurately describe the characters like we talked about before. But on the other hand, this is the February 1973 edition, and Star Trek began syndication in Japan in April '69. So I would think that the artist, if he was in fact living in Japan, would have had opportunity to see it. But then I don't know if we would have had such an interesting cover. Just really enjoy this cover here, so I wanted to share it. And we even get a scene down below. That's the scene where we see Spock 1 and Spock 2 duking it out down there on the surface of Organia. That's during that wild psychedelic hand-to-hand combat that I was talking about before. And I guess I should mention that was released by Kayakawa Publishing in 1973. Great cover, probably my favorite cover of all of these. But now we get to the point, I'm going to put up a gallery of the covers that we just looked at here and ask you if you have a favorite cover out of these four that we looked at here. You have a favorite cover artist in general? Do you have a favorite Star Trek cover that we aren't talking about here today that you really liked? My sentimental favorite out of these four has got to be that very first bright orange cover that I first picked up in 1970, back when I was just a kid, mourning the loss of new Star Trek episodes. But I just have to say that Japanese cover by Toru is the one that I enjoy looking at the most. I wish I could find a copy of that edition. I've looked and I just can't find anywhere on eBay or anywhere else. But there you have it, folks. So thanks for joining me. I guess we will bid a fond farewell to Book Trek 2024, The Wrath of the Summer of Trek, and look forward to next year's Book Trek and see what we have to talk about then. I don't know if I'm going to be able to wait to do more Star Trek videos between now and then. Like I say, I've been a lifelong Star Trek fan anyway, and I was planning on doing more Book Trek videos this year. Couldn't get around to it. I'm glad I'm able to sneak this last one in here at the last minute. But hopefully we will chat again about Star Trek soon and other books coming up. And I thank you very much for watching and look forward to chatting again soon.